The emergency room doors slammed open at 2:47 in the morning, and a 200-pound man in a military jacket was on his knees on the linoleum floor, pressing both hands against the side of a bleeding Belgian Malinois like he was trying to hold the dog's life inside its body. Every doctor in that hallway took one step back. The dog's teeth were out. Its eyes were wild. It was snarling at everyone who came within 6 feet. Then a woman in faded scrubs walked past all of them, crouched down in the blood, and the dog went still. Nobody in that room knew why. Nobody knew who she really was. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it means everything to a small channel trying to reach people. Subscribe so you never miss what's coming next, because the stories we tell here don't go where you expect them to go. And drop a comment. Tell me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. People are watching from places I never imagined, and every single comment proves it. Now, let's go back to that emergency room floor, and let me tell you everything about the woman they almost destroyed. The night before any of it happened, Nora Voss was standing in the break room of Ridgeline Valley Medical Center in Caldwell, Wyoming, eating a granola bar over the sink because she hadn't had time to sit down for a meal in 11 hours. She was 41 years old. She had a scar that ran from her left wrist to the middle of her forearm. An uneven ridge of pale skin she'd covered with a simple black line tattoo that most people assumed was a minimalist design choice. Nobody asked about it. She preferred that. Her scrubs were faded blue, the kind that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and thin at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back with 2 rubber bands because she'd lost her hair tie somewhere around hour 3 of the shift. There was a smear of betadine on her left sleeve and a ballpoint pen clipped to her collar that had been leaking for the past hour, which she hadn't noticed yet. She was not impressive looking. She knew that. She'd long since stopped worrying about it. What she was thinking about, standing there over the sink, was the patient in Bay 4, a 70-year-old man with congestive heart failure whose family kept pulling her aside in the hallway to ask if he was dying, and she had to keep finding careful, honest ways to say, "We're doing everything we can," without using it as the hollow phrase it usually was, because in his case they actually were, and she needed them to understand the difference. She was still turning the right words over in her head when the door opened and Margaret Sloan walked in. Margaret was her direct supervisor, charge nurse, 12 years at Ridgeline. She wore her authority the way some people wear a new coat, slightly stiff, always conscious of how it looked. She was not a bad person, exactly, but she was the kind of person who had built her sense of stability entirely around following the structure above her, which meant that when the structure above her was wrong, Margaret didn't have much internal scaffolding left to stand on. "I need to talk to you," Margaret said. Nora set down the granola bar. "Okay." Dr. Fallon filed a formal complaint about the Peterson incident. Nora kept her face still. "He ordered potassium chloride at a concentration that would have stopped that man's heart. I caught a transcription error and flagged it through the right channels. That's not an incident. That's called doing my job. You told him directly that he was wrong, in front of 2 other nurses and a patient's family member." "I told him quietly. The family member was standing 6 feet away and I couldn't make her invisible." Margaret pressed her lips together. "Nora, this is the 3rd complaint in 8 months. 2 of those were patients I escalated because I thought they were being discharged too early. One of them had a pulmonary embolism 40 minutes after I flagged the concern. The other one had a perforated appendix." "I know. So the complaints were about me being right." "The complaints," Margaret said, and her voice had that particular careful flatness that meant she was delivering someone else's message and didn't entirely believe it herself, "are about you being difficult to work with, and Dr. Fallon has requested a formal review." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "What does that mean?" "It means you should probably start thinking about whether Ridgeline is the right fit for you long term." That was the phrase they used, right fit. It was a phrase Nora had heard before, in other rooms, in other buildings, and she'd learned that it never meant what it claimed to mean. It didn't mean competence. It didn't mean care. It meant compliance. And she'd never been good at compliance when compliance was the wrong answer. "Am I being fired?" she asked. "You're being reviewed," Margaret said. "There's a difference." She left. Nora stood at the sink and looked at the granola bar on the counter and thought about the man in Bay 4 and his family in the hallway And the right way to say we're actually trying, so people believed you. She finished the granola bar. She went back to work. The review was scheduled for Thursday morning. By Wednesday night, Nora had already mentally drafted 2 versions of how it would go. One where she was given a written warning and a probationary period, one where they handed her a termination agreement and asked her to sign it before she left the building. She'd been in enough institutions to know how these things moved, and Ridgeline was not different from the others except in the specific names of the people running it. The hospital director was a man named Dr. Stuart Price. He'd come from an insurance background, which said everything you needed to know about how decisions got made at Ridgeline. He had a habit of using the word metrics in contexts where most doctors would use the word patients, and he had been, she'd heard, the one who approved the formal review after Fallon made his complaint. She didn't know him well. She'd spoken to him twice, both times briefly in hallways, both times about issues she'd escalated that had ended up being correct. He had thanked her in a way that felt like he was marking a box. She was not thinking about Price at 2:47 in the morning when the double doors came open. She was thinking about the IV line in Bay 7 that needed checking, and whether the family in the waiting room had been updated, and whether she'd remembered to note the medication change in the chart for the woman in Bay 2. Then she heard it. A sound that was not quite a bark and not quite a growl. Something lower, more fundamental, the sound of an animal at the absolute outer edge of what it could endure. And underneath it the sound of a man's voice, rough and cracked, saying, "Stay with me, just stay with me." She turned around. The man was maybe 50, though he looked older in the way that outdoors and stress, and probably not enough sleep, can age someone by a decade. He was wearing a canvas jacket with a Wyoming state flag patch on one sleeve and a faded name tape on the chest that read Reyes. He had his arms around a large Belgian Malinois, and both of them were on the floor just inside the entrance, and the dog's left hind leg was at an angle that was immediately, viscerally wrong. Blood on the floor, blood on the man's jacket, blood on the dog's tan and black coat. Dr. Fallon was standing at the nurse's station. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at the dog. He took a step backward. "We can't treat animals here," he said. "This is a human emergency room." "He's hurt," the man said. He didn't yell it. His voice was completely flat, which was somehow worse than yelling. "He's going into shock." "Sir, I understand your animal is injured, but—" "His name is Camo," the man said. "And if he dies on this floor because you wouldn't help him, I will not be reasonable about it." 2 other nurses had appeared from the hallway. Neither of them moved toward the dog. The Malinois was watching all of them with eyes that were both terrified and furious, which was a very specific combination that Nora recognized, and its lips were pulled back from its teeth, and its breathing was too fast and too shallow. She was already walking forward before she made a conscious decision to do it. She heard Margaret say her name from somewhere behind her. She crouched down about 4 feet from the dog and stopped. Camo's eyes snapped to her. The growl got lower. She didn't reach out. She didn't speak immediately. She just stayed where she was, at his eye level, and let him look at her, and she looked back at him without flinching, without performing calm, just actually being still in a way that took years to learn and couldn't be faked. The growl didn't stop, but it changed pitch, just slightly. She said quietly, I know it hurts. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't." The man, Reyes, was watching her with an expression she couldn't read yet. His hands were still pressed against the dog's side. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked. Not to the dog, to the man. "Barbed wire fence out back of my property. He went through it. I don't know. He spooked at something. His leg caught. He pulled free, but—" Reyes stopped. His jaw worked. "He's been down for about 20 minutes. I drove straight here because it was closer than the animal ER, and He stopped again. "I didn't know what else to do." Nora looked at the leg. The way it was angled suggested the wire had caught near the joint. She could see lacerations, significant bleeding, and the positioning of the limb suggested possible ligament damage. The dog's gums, when she carefully angled herself to see without pushing into his space, were pale, heart rate fast, breathing labored. He was not just in pain, he was in early circulatory shock. "Nora, Margaret's voice from behind her, controlled but tight. This isn't within our scope. We need to contact the emergency veterinary clinic on Route 9. Route 9 is 40 minutes away, Reyes said without looking up. He doesn't have 40 minutes. Nora looked at Camo. She knew what she was seeing. She'd seen it before, in very different circumstances, in places where the nearest actual help was sometimes measured in hours rather than minutes. She'd made decisions under those conditions that had nothing to do with the hospital protocol manual. She reached into her left scrub pocket and pulled out a pair of gloves. I'm going to need a saline flush, pressure bandaging, and a warming blanket, she said. She didn't raise her voice. She said it the way she said most things, which was at a reasonable volume with the expectation that she would be heard. And someone called Dr. Marin Cho at the Ridgeline Veterinary Emergency Referral. She's on our specialist list for large animal trauma assists. Her number is in the system. Nobody moved. Now, Nora said. Same volume, same tone, absolute. A younger nurse named Tobias, 2 months into his first ER rotation, still in the phase where he was watching everyone to figure out who actually knew what they were doing, turned and went to get the supplies. Camo let her close the remaining distance. He was trembling. When she got her gloved hand near his shoulder, he flinched, but he didn't snap. She kept her hand there, not petting, just present, and talked quietly. Not comforting nonsense, just low, steady narration of what she was doing and why, the way she'd been taught, the way she'd done it before. His rear leg is the primary injury, she said to Reyes, but I'm more concerned right now about his circulation. How much blood has he lost? A lot, Reyes said. He left a trail across the field. Okay. She started working. What's his age? 7. How long has he been retired? There was a half-second pause. 2 years? From? Another pause, longer this time. Army, 75th Ranger Support Unit. He was a patrol dog, 2 deployments. Nora kept her hand steady. His service records read, Are they with you? In the truck. Why? Because 7-year-old working dog with prior deployment history has a different baseline than a 7-year-old family pet. And if Dr. Cho is going to treat him, I want her to have his full picture. Reyes looked at her with an expression that had shifted from the flat-controlled desperation she'd seen when he came in to something more complicated. Like he'd expected one thing and gotten another. He said, You know working dogs. I know a lot of things, she said. Go get the file from your truck. I'll stay with him. Dr. Fallon had left the hallway. She registered that but didn't have room to think about it yet. What she was focused on was the next 12 minutes, which were the only minutes that mattered right now. She got the saline flush running and started on the pressure wrapping for the leg laceration, which required her to work around Camo's instinct to pull away, which she did by pausing every time he tensed and waiting until he settled before continuing, which was not efficient but was the only method that would actually work without sedation, and they were not set up to sedate him here. Tobias came back with the warming blanket and unfolded it without being asked, which told her something good about him. Hold this at his shoulder, she told him, not over his head. Don't lean over him. Yes, ma'am. He did exactly what she said, which told her something even better. Reyes came back in with a manila folder, thick and slightly damp at the edges from the cold outside. He sat down on the floor beside his dog again and held the folder out to her. She took it with her cleaner hand and flipped it open one-handed and scanned it. 7 years old, 81 pounds at retirement, prior injury notation at the left hip, blunt trauma, field incident, 2 years before retirement. Recovery noted as full, but the notation was brief in a way that felt like shorthand for we didn't look as hard as we should have. She paused on that. She went back to it. There was a check mark in a box next to mobility assessment, within normal parameters at time of retirement. But the follow-up section, the section that should have contained a 6-month and 12-month post-service wellness evaluation, was empty. Not blank in a way that suggested there was nothing to report. Blank in a way that suggested nobody had filled it in. She set the folder down. When was Camo's last full veterinary evaluation? They did one when he was released to me, Reyes said. Retirement physical. Cleared him. Anything since then? Routine checkups, shots, nothing major. He was watching her hands while she worked. Why? She looked at the way Camo was holding his unhurt front leg, slightly rotated inward, just barely, the kind of compensation that happened when an animal had been favoring one side long enough that it had adjusted its entire posture around the accommodation. She looked at the way he'd been lying when she first approached. Not the position of an animal in acute injury, but a familiar position, a resting position the body had learned to fall into. She said, "His hip." "What about it?" "Prior injury, left side. It's in his file. They said he recovered." "I know what they said." She kept her voice even. "I'm asking you to tell me if you've noticed him moving differently in the last year, slower to get up in the morning, reluctant to jump, shifting his weight when he stands still." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally, "but I figured it was age." "It might be," she said, "or it might be that his retirement evaluation wasn't as thorough as it should have been." She said it carefully. Not as an accusation, not as a certainty, but she watched Reyes hear it, and she watched something change in his face. Not anger yet, but the beginning of a question he hadn't known to ask. She had just enough time to notice that before the door at the end of the hallway opened and Dr. Stuart Price walked in. He was wearing his day clothes, which meant someone had called him in, which meant this had already traveled further up the chain than she'd realized. He walked the length of the hallway and stopped several feet away and looked at the scene in front of him. Nurse on the floor with a military dog, blood on the linoleum, warming blanket, pressure wrapping, the whole tableau. He said, "Nora, what exactly are you doing?" She didn't look up from her work. "Stabilizing a patient." "He is not a patient. This is a human medical facility." He was the closest emergency option available, and he was in early shock. "I made a judgment call." "You made a judgment call," Price repeated. He had a way of repeating things back that was designed to make them sound absurd. "That's what this is." She finished the pressure wrapping and sat back on her heels. Camo's breathing had slowed slightly. His gums were still pale, but not as pale as when they'd come in. She looked up at Price for the first time. "Dr. Cho is 45 minutes out. He'll be stable enough to transport by then. His owner has his full service records. The primary leg injury is significant but manageable, and I've identified what may be a secondary pre-existing condition that the veterinarian will need to evaluate." Price stared at her. "And your shift?" "My shift can wait." He couldn't. "This hospital's liability insurance is a conversation for later," she said. Not rudely, factually. "Right now I need you to not make this harder than it has to be." Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reyes, who was watching him with the particular stillness of a man who had been in situations significantly more dangerous than a hospital hallway and was therefore not impressed by authority for its own sake. Price said, "We'll discuss this tomorrow morning. Your review has been moved to 8 a.m. He turned and walked back down the hallway. Nora looked back at Camo. "It's okay," she said to the dog. "We've got time." Marchant. Dr. Marin Cho arrived at 3:41 a.m., and Nora gave her the handoff the way she gave all handoffs, complete, sequential, organized, with the relevant file flagged at the page that mattered. Cho was efficient and unsentimental in the way good veterinary emergency specialists often were, and she went straight to work. Before they loaded Camo into Cho's vehicle for transport, Reyes stood up and turned to Nora. He was not a man who looked like he said things he didn't mean. He had the kind of face that had learned economy, that knew words cost something. "Thank you," he said. "He did the hard part," she said. "He trusts you." She looked at Camo, who was on a temporary stretcher now, still watching her with those dark, exhausted eyes that were already a little less frantic than they'd been an hour ago. "Working dogs are different," she said. "They read people. They've had to." She paused. "Make sure Dr. Cho has the full service file. Tell her about the hip. Make her look." Reyes nodded. He picked up the folder. Then he said, the way you say something when you're actually curious rather than just making conversation, "Where did you learn all that?" It wasn't quite a question. It was an observation waiting to be confirmed or denied. Nora said, "I learned a lot of things in a lot of places." She peeled off her gloves. "Drive safe." She watched them go. She looked at the blood on the floor. She looked at the clock. 4:06 a.m. She had 4 hours before the review. She picked up the mop. The 8 a.m. meeting had a different energy than she'd expected. Price was there. Margaret was there. A woman named Dolores Calm from Human Resources sat to the left with a file folder. Dr. Fallon was present via speakerphone, which meant he'd been formal enough about this to want a record, but not present enough to be in the room. Nora sat across from them. Price opened with a prepared statement about liability and institutional protocol and the difference between compassionate care and unilateral decision-making. Nora listened. She did not interrupt. She let him finish. Then she said, "I have a question about the second complaint on that list." "The Peterson dosage incident," Cam said, already finding the page. "The transcription error on the potassium chloride order," Nora said. "The concentration that was ordered would have caused cardiac arrest. I flagged it. The patient is alive. I'd like to understand what aspect of that outcome constitutes grounds for a complaint." Fallon's voice came through the speaker, slightly compressed. "You question my clinical judgment in front of staff. I asked a clarifying question about an order that would have killed a 63-year-old man. I'd do it again." The room was quiet. Margaret was not looking at her. She was looking at the table, and Nora had known her long enough to understand that the expression on her face was not hostility. It was something closer to discomfort, which was a different problem. Price said, "Nora, what happened last night was a serious violation of protocol. And this pattern," he gestured at the file, "this pattern suggests that you consistently prioritize your individual assessment over institutional process." "I prioritize patients," she said. "When the two things conflict, yes, I side with the patient. That's not an approach the institution can sustain," she finished for him. "I've heard that before. Usually right before someone hands me papers to sign." Price looked at Cam. Cam looked at the folder. "We're not terminating you today," Price said. "We're placing you on administrative leave pending the full review. Your access badge will be deactivated at the end of this meeting. You'll be contacted within 10 business days." She looked at him. She looked at Margaret, who was still looking at the table. She said, "The man who came in last night, his dog's retirement file has an incomplete wellness evaluation. Someone signed off on a hip assessment that wasn't done properly. That's not relevant to—" "I think it might be," she said. "But that's not your problem right now. That's mine." She stood up. She put her badge on the table. She left. Bullshit. She drove home in the early morning light with the heat on and the radio off, and she sat in the parking lot of her apartment building for a few minutes before going inside because she needed the transition time. The space between the version of herself that had been in that room and the version that would now figure out what came next. She'd been fired before. Not for anything she was ashamed of, but she'd been in institutions long enough to know that being right was not the same thing as being protected. She went inside. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the scar on her arm, the pale ridge under the black ink of the tattoo, and she thought about Camo's file and the empty evaluation boxes and the way the hip notation had been brief in that particular way. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Wyoming area code. She picked up. "Nora Voss?" The voice was male, mid-40s, official without being aggressive about it. "Who's asking?" "My name is Agent Dennis Hargrove, Defense Criminal Investigative Service." A pause. "We've been watching a situation develop for a while. We'd like to talk to you about a retired military working dog named Camo, his service records, and what you noticed last night." Another pause. "We think you noticed something nobody else has bothered to notice yet." She looked at the scar on her arm. She looked at the coffee in her cup. She said, "How soon can you be here?" Agent Dennis Hargrove arrived in 40 minutes, which told her he hadn't been calling from far away. He was not what she'd pictured. She'd pictured a suit, something pressed and federal, the kind of appearance that announced itself. What came through her door instead was a man in a heavy canvas jacket with a coffee stain near the second button, carrying a briefcase that had seen better years, with the look of someone who'd been awake since before she had. He was accompanied by a younger woman he introduced as Agent Paula Strick, who had a notebook already open before she sat down. Nora made them coffee because she'd already made too much and because it gave her something to do with her hands while she thought. She set the mugs on the table and sat across from them and waited. Hargrove wrapped both hands around the mug and said, "How much do you know about the military working dog retirement process?" Enough, she said. They're evaluated, cleared, released to handlers or adoption programs. There are supposed to be follow-up wellness checks. Supposed to be, he said. I noticed the follow-up section on Camo's file was empty. We noticed the same thing on 47 other files. He set his mug down. Over 3 years. She looked at him. 47. 47 dogs whose post-service wellness evaluations were either incomplete, falsified, or never conducted at all. Dogs that were cleared for retirement with injuries and conditions that weren't disclosed. In some cases, conditions that were documented during service and then, he paused, choosing the word deliberately, disappeared from the retirement paperwork. Strick turned a page in her notebook without looking up. 3 of those dogs have died since retirement, causes consistent with untreated chronic conditions. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, Nora could hear a car passing on the street, and then nothing. Who's running the evaluations, she asked. A private contractor called Meridian Canine Solutions, Hargrove said. They hold the federal contract for retirement assessment and placement services for military working dogs across 4 branches. They've held it for 6 years. He reached into the briefcase and set a folder on the table. They've been paid approximately $11 million over that period. Nora looked at the folder but didn't open it yet. And the evaluations are fraudulent. We believe so. We've been building a case for 8 months, but we have an evidence problem. He looked at her directly. We have documents. We have financial records. What we don't have is someone who can look at a dog's physical file and tell us, medically and specifically, what should have been caught, what was missed, and what was deliberately obscured. We need someone who understands both military working dog physiology and the documentation standards for field medical records. You need a vet, she said. We need someone who can bridge the military medical side and the veterinary side, Strick said. It was the first thing she'd said since introducing herself. Most veterinarians don't have military records experience. Most people with military records experience don't have the medical depth. You have both. Nora sat with that for a moment. She turned her coffee cup in a slow half circle on the table. What happened with Camo specifically? She asked. Hargrove opened the folder himself and slid a page across to her. His retirement evaluation was conducted by a Meridian contractor named Gary Purcell. Purcell signed off on a full mobility and joint assessment. According to the file, Camo had no significant musculoskeletal findings at time of retirement. Nora looked at the page. Then she looked up. His hip has been compensating for at least a year, probably longer. The muscle atrophy on the left side is visible in the way he was positioned when he came in. That doesn't happen in 2 years. That happens in 4 or 5. Which means the injury predates his retirement. Which means either Purcell didn't examine him properly or Purcell wrote what he was paid to write. Hargrove nodded once. We've been trying to prove that for 8 months. Dr. Cho sent us her preliminary findings this morning. He slid another page across. She agrees with your assessment. The hip degeneration is significantly advanced for an animal whose last documented injury was 18 months before retirement. Nora read the page. Cho's notes were precise and unembellished, the kind of clinical writing that didn't editorialize because it didn't need to. The findings spoke without help. She set the page down. You said you've been watching the situation develop, she said to Hargrove. Did you know about me before last night? He was quiet for just a fraction of a second too long. We knew Camo's file had anomalies. We knew Reyes had concerns he hadn't formally reported because he didn't know who to report them to. When he brought the dog to your ER and you flagged the hip notation within, he glanced at Strick. What was it, 90 minutes? Approximately, Strick said. 90 minutes of seeing the file, we were contacted by Dr. Cho's office. He folded his hands on the table. You found what our investigators had spent 3 months trying to articulate. Nora thought about the folder, the weight of the blank boxes, the way the notation had been brief in that specific way. The way shorthand for we didn't looked different from shorthand for there was nothing to find. She said, I want to see the other 47 files. She spent the rest of that day at her kitchen table, which was not big enough for what they spread across it, so they moved to the floor. Hargrove went to get a second box from his car and came back looking slightly winded from the stairs, which he didn't comment on. Strick rearranged the files into a grid on the living room floor, while Nora changed into clothes that weren't scrubs and came back with a legal pad and 3 pens. She started reading at 10:15 in the morning. By 1 in the afternoon, she had filled 12 pages of notes and hadn't touched the second cup of coffee Strick had quietly placed next to her at some point. The pattern emerged faster than she expected and was more specific than she'd feared. It wasn't random neglect. Sloppy evaluations could look random. Different assessors, different days, different animals, variants that looked like incompetence. This wasn't that. The falsifications followed a structure. Injuries that had been noted during the animal's service record, hip dysplasia, shoulder damage, spinal compression, the accumulated physics of a working dog's career, appeared clearly in the service documentation and then were either minimized or entirely absent from the retirement assessment. The language changed. Mild discomfort noted became within normal parameters, became no significant findings in the span of 3 to 6 months. The progression was deliberate. Someone had looked at the prior documentation and written against it. Whoever did this knew what they were reading, she said, without looking up. They knew the service records would show prior findings, so they used transitional language to make it look like recovery rather than omission. But the timeline doesn't work. You don't recover from hip dysplasia. You manage it. There's no version of these findings where an animal goes from mild dysplasia noted in the field records to no musculoskeletal concerns 18 months later. That's not a recovery trajectory. That's an erased record. Hargrove had been sitting on her couch for the past hour, which she'd stopped noticing. He said, "Can you document that in a way that would hold up to expert challenge?" "Yes," she said. "But I need the corresponding service veterinary records for comparison. The retirement files alone aren't enough. I need what they wrote against." "We can get those," Strick said. "How fast?" 2 days, maybe 3. Nora set her pen down. She looked at the files spread across her floor. 47 folders, 47 dogs, 47 sets of falsified paperwork, and felt the specific weight of a problem that was bigger than any one piece of it. "These animals were used," she said. "They worked. They deployed. Some of them are in the field records for combat operations. I've seen 3 incident notations in this stack that reference active operational environments." She paused. "And when they were done, someone made sure their injuries stayed invisible, so a company could close out their files cleanly and collect a government check." "That's what we believe," Hargrove said. "That's what the paperwork says," she corrected. "Belief is where you started. Documentation is where you are now." He almost smiled. "Bear." She picked up her pen. "I need the service records." They came back the following morning with 2 more boxes and a secure laptop for her to use for cross-referencing federal veterinary databases. Strick set it up at the kitchen table while Hargrove made himself at home with the coffee maker in a way that suggested he'd decided they were going to be here for a while and had adjusted accordingly. Nora worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and she was midway through her 14th comparative analysis when her phone buzzed on the counter. Margaret Sloan. She let it buzz twice, then picked up. "Nora." Margaret's voice was careful. "I wanted you to hear this from me rather than from someone else." "Okay." "Dr. Price filed the formal termination this morning. HR is sending the paperwork by courier." A pause. I want you to know I didn't recommend it. I told them the review should run its full course." Nora looked at the file in her hand. One of the dogs in this stack had been named Brix, Belgian Malinois, like Camo, deployed twice. Service record that included a notation for vertebral compression at year 4 of service. Retirement file clean. Brix had been placed with a family in Colorado and had died 14 months later. The official cause of death listed was cardiac event. She was looking at what the service record said about his spine and thinking about what a 14-month timeline meant for an animal with untreated vertebral compression. She said, "Margaret, did anyone tell you why I was specifically placed on administrative leave before the formal review ran its course?" Price said, "Did anyone tell you that Camo's retirement file had incomplete wellness documentation? That I flagged it the night I treated him?" A silence. "No," Margaret said. "Nobody told me that. Somebody should have. She set Brix's file down. Thank you for calling. She hung up and went back to work. The termination paperwork arrived by courier at 3:40. She signed for it, set it on the counter without opening it, and kept working. It was Strick who noticed. She glanced at the envelope and then back at her screen without saying anything, but something in the quality of her not saying anything was attentive enough that Nora registered it. I've been fired before, Nora said, without looking up from the file. For something you didn't do wrong? Usually for something I did right. She turned a page. It gets easier to distinguish between the two. Strick looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to her screen. At 5:20, Nora found it. It wasn't in the retirement files. It was in the cross-reference service records, specifically in the administrative trail, the layer of paperwork beneath the medical layer, the procurement documentation and contractor invoicing that she'd been pulling up as background context. Meridian Canine Solutions had been issuing what they called expedited clearance fees, an internal billing code that didn't correspond to any documented service in their federal contract. The fees were small, inconsistent, and attached to specific retirement assessments. Not all of them. 17 of the 47. The 17 with the most significant discrepancies between service records and retirement findings. She stared at the screen. Hargrove, she said. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup. Yeah. These expedited clearance fees, do you have the full billing records from Meridian? We have partial billing records. There's a subpoena pending for the complete financial documentation. Pull the partial records right now. She turned the laptop toward him. Look at the billing dates. Look at which retirement files they correspond to. He set down the coffee and came around to look. She watched his face. It took him about 90 seconds. Those are the assessors, he said quietly. The specific assessors who signed the fraudulent evaluations. They weren't just falsifying records, she said. They were being paid per file. The expedited clearance fee is the payment mechanism. Someone inside Meridian was running a tiered system. Assessors who were willing to write clean evaluations on animals with documented prior conditions got a bonus. Per assessment, under a billing code buried in the contract administration paperwork. The kitchen was very quiet. Strick had appeared in the doorway behind Hargrove. She looked at the screen, then at Nora. How did you find that? She said. I've read a lot of military medical paperwork, Nora said. I know what a clean record looks like, and I know what a managed record looks like. And I know what a payment structure looks like when someone's trying to hide it in the administrative layer. She leaned back in her chair. I spent 3 years processing field medical reimbursements for a forward operating base before I went into direct care. You learn to see the accounting. Hargrove straightened up. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. Not quite surprise, something more like recalibration. The moment when someone revised their working model of who you were. We need to get this to the lead prosecutor tonight, he said. I know. She stood and stretched her back, which had been complaining for the last hour. But first I want to finish the remaining files, because I think the 17 with the billing anomalies are the ones that went through a specific regional coordinator. And if that coordinator is still employed by Meridian, he is, Strick said, then he's still doing it. The room went still in a particular way that meant they'd all arrived at the same place at the same time. Hargrove said, there are dogs currently in the retirement pipeline. If the contract is still active and the coordinator is still in place, Nora said, yes. He looked at Strick. Something passed between them that was the shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough to have a language for urgency that didn't require full sentences. I need to make a call, he said. He went out to the hallway. She could hear his voice through the door. Controlled, clipped, the cadence of someone conveying information to someone who needed it fast and accurate. Strick was already typing. Nora went back to the files. She was on the 43rd folder when Hargrove came back in. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his phone still in his hand and a different quality to his stillness than she'd seen from him before. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but the stillness of someone who'd just been told something that changed the shape of what was in front of them. What? She said. Gary Purcell, he said, the assessor who signed Camo's retirement evaluation. What about him? He was found at his home in Laramie this afternoon. He had a document shredder going when federal agents arrived pursuant to a separate arm of the investigation. And he stopped for a half second. He made a phone call 40 minutes before agents arrived. We have the outgoing number. She waited. The number belongs to a cell phone registered to a doctor. Stuart Price, Hargrove said, director of Ridgeline Valley Medical Center. The file in Nora's hand was for a dog named Sable, 7 years old, German Shepherd. Prior knee injury documented at year 3 of service, absent from retirement assessment. Sable had been cleared by Gary Purcell 11 months ago. She was currently placed with a veteran's family in Gillette. She set the file down. She thought about Price in the hallway at 4 in the morning, looking at her with that controlled administrative distance. She thought about the formal review appearing on her schedule a day before Camo ever walked through the door. She thought about the termination paperwork moving faster than institutional reviews ever moved. She said, "He knew I would look at the file." "We think he was warned," Hargrove said. "Before Reyes even came in, someone in the contractor network may have flagged that Reyes had been asking questions about Camo's hip condition. If Price was connected to Meridian's operations in any capacity, he made sure I was already on the way out before I had a chance to find anything." "That would be consistent with the timeline," Strick said quietly. Nora sat with that for a moment. The particular quality of realizing that something you thought had happened to you had actually been done to you. The difference between circumstance and calculation. "Then my termination," she said, "wasn't about Fallon's complaint." "We don't think so," Hargrove said. She looked at the 43 files on her living room floor and the 4 remaining on the kitchen table. She looked at the secure laptop with its tabs of billing records and service documentation and the half-completed analysis she'd been building all day. "I need to finish the remaining files," she said. "Nora, I need to finish them tonight," she said. "Because if Purcell was shredding documents this afternoon and he called Price before agents arrived, then someone in that network knows the investigation has moved. And if there are dogs currently in the retirement pipeline with a compromised assessor..." "We've already flagged the pipeline to the contracting office," Strick said. "Meridian's current assessments are suspended pending..." "Pending what? A review that takes 6 weeks?" She looked at Strick directly. "How many dogs are in the current retirement queue?" Strick glanced at her screen. Her face said what she hadn't said yet. 19, she said. Nora picked up the next file. "Then I'm finishing tonight," she said. She opened the folder. Hargrove looked at Strick. Neither of them left. Outside, the Wyoming night had gone fully dark and the temperature had dropped, and the street below the apartment window was empty and silent. And somewhere in Laramie, a man named Gary Purcell was sitting in a federal interview room, having realized too late that the phone call he'd made in a panic had not protected him, but had instead handed investigators the connection they'd been missing for 8 months. And somewhere inside the Meridian Canine Solutions Contractor Network, someone had received a message in the last 4 hours that they did not yet understand meant it was already over. That the nurse they'd made sure to fire before she could find anything had already found everything and had been finding it all day and was not done yet. The folder in her hand was for a dog named Ren, Belgian Malinois, 6 years old. Deployed once to a forward operating base in a location her service record described only by sector designation. The notation at year 2 of service read, "Minor soft tissue damage, left forelimb, resolved with rest and treatment. Return to duty within 6 weeks. The retirement assessment, signed by an assessor whose name she hadn't seen before on any other file, read, "No prior injury concerns noted." Nora picked up her pen. She wrote the assessor's name at the top of her legal pad and drew a circle around it. Then she flipped back 3 pages in her notes to where she'd listed the expedited clearance billing codes and scanned down the column of assessor IDs. The name matched. She stared at it for a moment. Then she wrote the number 18 next to the circle, because that was how many files now carried this pattern. And that number had just grown, and the billing trail had just acquired another branch, and somewhere attached to that branch was a payment and a payee and a paper record that a shredder in Laramie had not reached in time. She looked up at Hargrove. "You said the subpoena for Meridian's full billing records is pending," she said. "It was filed this morning." "Push it," she said. "Because the assessor on this file..." She turned the legal pad toward him. Their ID appears in your partial billing records 4 times. And I just found their signature on a file that wasn't in the original 17. Hargrove leaned forward and looked at the name. His expression did something complicated. That assessor, he said slowly, is Gary Purcell's direct supervisor. The apartment was absolutely quiet. Strick had stopped typing. Nora looked at the file in her hand. At Wren's service record, the notation about the forelimb injury, the careful documentation of a working dog's body being used until it wore down. And she thought about what it meant that a supervisor had personally signed a fraudulent evaluation, what level of confidence that required, what it said about how far up the structure the arrangement went. She thought about the phone call Purcell had made to Price before the agents arrived. She thought about how many people had known she was going to be fired before she'd walked into that review. And she understood, in the particular way that certain kinds of information settle, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of what the pattern had already been saying, that this was not a mid-level contractor scheme. This went somewhere else. And whoever was at the other end of it had no idea yet that the fired nurse they'd been so careful to remove was sitting on her living room floor with 43 annotated files and a legal pad that was running out of pages. She ran out of pages on the legal pad at 11:40 that night and found a spiral notebook in her desk drawer and kept going. By 1 in the morning, she had worked through all 47 files plus the 3 additional cases Strick had pulled from the pending retirement queue when the suspension order went through. The living room floor looked like a document explosion, folders and rough geographic clusters, her annotation sheets overlapping at the edges, a separate stack for the 18 files with confirmed billing anomalies, and a third stack for cases where she suspected manipulation but needed the full Meridian financial records to confirm. Hargrove had been on his phone in her hallway for most of the last 2 hours. She could hear him in fragments, controlled, specific, the kind of language that meant he was talking to people above him who were making decisions based on what he was telling them. Strick had stopped typing around midnight and switched to a printed form she was filling out by hand, which Nora recognized as a federal evidence intake document, the kind you filled out when something had moved from investigation to prosecution. She finished the last annotation, set her pen down, and looked at the floor. 47 dogs, 18 confirmed fraudulent evaluations with linked payment structures, 7 probable cases pending financial verification, 3 animals currently in pre-retirement status who had been pulled from Meridian's pipeline in time, and 1 name, the supervisor's, circled at the top of her notepad, that sat above everything else like the highest point of a very ugly architecture. The supervisor's name was Raymond Call. Hargrove had confirmed it when she'd shown him the match. He hadn't said much beyond that, which told her Call was significant enough that Hargrove was being careful about what he said out loud before the case was formally airtight. She stood up, which her back objected to loudly, and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and drank a glass of water and tried to decide if she was hungry. She wasn't really, but she ate 4 crackers anyway because she knew from long experience that the version of herself that forgot to eat was harder to work with than the version that ate badly. Hargrove came in from the hallway. "We're getting the full billing records tonight," he said. "Emergency subpoena. Judge signed off an hour ago." He paused. "The prosecutor wants to talk to you tomorrow morning." "What time?" 8. She almost laughed. 8 again. "Fine." He looked at the kitchen counter, at the crackers, at the glass of water, at her face, which she knew was carrying the particular texture of someone who had been thinking hard for 14 straight hours and was running on the part of the tank that didn't have a gauge. "When did you last sleep?" he said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I'll sleep when the files are documented." "The files are documented. You've been documenting them for 12 hours. The documentation needs to be organized into a format the prosecutor can use. The billing correlation needs a summary that doesn't require someone to read 40 pages of my handwriting." She set down the glass. "I'll sleep after that." Hargrove looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who understood that arguing was not going to be productive and had decided to spend that energy elsewhere. "Strick can help with the summary," he said. "Strick has her own documentation to complete." "Nora." "I know what I'm doing," she said, not defensively, just as a statement of fact. "I've worked through worse than this on less than this. Let me finish." He let it go. He went back to the hallway. She went back to the floor and started building the summary structure, which took her another 2 hours and required reorganizing the stacks 3 times because the first 2 organizational systems she tried weren't going to be legible to someone who hadn't spent the last 12 hours inside the material. She finished at 3:15. She sat back against the base of the couch and looked at the organized documentation spread across her floor and felt the specific colorless exhaustion of something completed rather than abandoned. She slept for 4 hours on the couch without intending to. Woke up at 7:12 with a stiff neck and a pen mark on the side of her hand she didn't remember making, and went to wash her face and change her clothes before Hargrove knocked on the door. The prosecutor's name was Adrienne Moss. She was from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cheyenne, and she had driven up that morning, which meant she'd left before 5, which told Nora something about how seriously the case had moved overnight. Moss was 40-something, compact, with the kind of face that had probably always looked more serious than she intended and had long since stopped trying to correct for it. She came in, shook Nora's hand with a grip that meant business without performing it, sat down at the kitchen table with a coffee she'd brought herself, and spent the first 12 minutes reading through Nora's summary document without speaking. Nora sat across from her and waited. "Walk me through the billing correlation," Moss said, without looking up. Nora walked her through it. She kept it clinical and sequential. The structure of the anomaly, the payment mechanism, the assessor ID matching, the supervisor's signature on the outlier file. Moss asked 3 questions, all of them precise, none of them wasted. The kind of questions that meant she'd already understood 90% of it and was filling the remaining 10. When Nora finished, Moss looked up. "The full billing records came in at 2 a.m. My team has been cross-referencing since then." She set the summary down. "You found the mechanism. The full records confirm it and expand it. There are 23 files with confirmed billing anomalies, not 18. Nora absorbed that. 5 more than she'd identified from the partial records. Which assessors? 3 additional ones in the eastern region, and Moss paused with the quality of someone choosing how to land something. The payment routing. The expedited clearance fees weren't paid directly to the assessors. They were routed through a secondary LLC that Meridian uses for what they classify as contract labor costs. The LLC has 3 registered principals. Call is one of them, Nora said. Yes. Moss looked at her steadily. The other 2 are a logistics coordinator named Brenda Ferris and a former Defense Department contract officer named Philip Anker, who retired from federal service 2 years ago and joined Meridian's board 8 months later. The kitchen was quiet. Nora thought about that timeline. Retired from federal service, joined the board 8 months later. The Meridian contract had been in place for 6 years. The question of how long Anker had been involved before he officially joined the board was a question Moss's team was certainly already asking. Anker had contracting authority when he was at DoD, she said. It wasn't a question. He oversaw the Military Working Dog Support Services contract renewal 4 years ago, Moss said, among other things. Nora sat back. So the person who renewed the contract that Meridian holds may have been financially connected to Meridian before the renewal. We are building that case, Moss said carefully. It requires a different evidentiary standard than the fraud itself. But yes, that is the shape of what we are looking at. What had felt like a contractor scheme 2 days ago had just grown a federal dimension. Nora looked at the files on the floor, the organized stacks, the summary she'd spent most of the night building, and recalibrated what they were actually sitting inside. And Price, she said. Stuart Price, Ridgeline's director. Moss's expression shifted just slightly. We are looking at his connection to Meridian's network. The phone call from Purcell is established. The nature of their relationship prior to that call is under investigation. She paused. What I can tell you is that Ridgeline Valley Medical Center has held a contract with Meridian Canine Solutions for the past 3 years. Nora stared at her. What kind of contract? Referral services. When retired military dogs in the region require medical care beyond veterinary scope, Meridian's contract with Ridgeline covers the facility costs. Moss let that sit for a moment. It's a small contract, but it's a relationship. and it means Price and Call have had a professional connection for 3 years. The shape of it came together in a way that was almost geometric. Each connection a line, the lines forming angles, the angles forming a structure that had been built carefully enough that it only became visible when you had all the pieces on the floor at once. "He didn't fire me because of Fallon's complaint," Nora said. "No," Moss said. "We don't believe he did. He fired me because someone told him I'd seen the file, and seeing the file, for someone with my background, meant I would eventually find what you just described." "The termination was processed in under 14 hours, Moss said. "Standard administrative review at Ridgeline takes a minimum of 5 business days. That acceleration required Price's direct intervention." Nora looked at the counter. At the crackers she hadn't finished. At the ordinary, unremarkable surface of a kitchen that had spent the last 2 days hosting something much larger than kitchens were usually asked to hold. She said, "What do you need from me now?" "I need you to be available," Moss said. "For testimony. For expert review of any additional files the investigation surfaces. And," she looked at Nora directly, "I need you to understand that what you've built here is the analytical foundation of this prosecution. The documents existed. The billing records existed. What you gave us is the medical interpretation that makes the fraud legible to a non-specialist jury. Without that, we have anomalies. With it, we have evidence." Nora thought about Camo's file. The blank boxes. The weight of the notation that had been brief in a specific way. She thought about Wren and Bricks and Sable and 39 others she now knew by name. "I'll be available," she said. Mugged. What she didn't expect was how fast the next 72 hours moved. The subpoena for Meridian's full operational records, not just billing, but internal communications, contractor assessments, personnel files, was executed on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Hargrove was at her door again with Strick and a third agent she hadn't met before, a woman named Tricia Dalton, who was introduced as the financial crimes specialist on the case, and who immediately sat down with Nora's billing correlation summary and started asking questions that were so specifically targeted that Nora had to consciously shift gears to keep up with her. What Dalton had found in the operational records changed the scope again. The LLC wasn't just a payment routing mechanism. It had been used to invoice Meridian for services that didn't exist: training consultations, regional site assessments, quality control audits, each one tied to a date and a location and a signatory, none of them matching any documented activity in Meridian's operational calendar. The invoices had been approved internally by Call, paid out of operating funds, and the money had moved through 2 additional shell accounts before arriving in the LLC's primary account. They were laundering the bonus payments through fake invoices, Nora said. "Correct," Dalton said, "which elevates the charge from contract fraud to wire fraud and money laundering. Federal charges, mandatory minimums, no plea structure that gets anyone out clean." She said it with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd spent a long time looking for exactly this and had now found it. The anchor connection is going to take longer to prosecute, but the core Meridian case is airtight. "How many people are we talking about?" Nora asked. Call, Purcell, the 3 additional assessors from the Eastern region, Brenda Ferris, and 2 others in Meridian's administrative structure who appear in the invoice approval chain. Dalton looked at her list. 7 arrests, coordinated. We're looking at 48 hours. Nora absorbed that. "And Price?" she said. Dalton looked at Hargrove. Hargrove said, "Price is more complicated. We need to establish what he knew and when. The phone call from Purcell is established. His relationship with Meridian through the Ridgeline contract is established. Whether he actively participated in the scheme to remove you, or whether he was reacting to a call he received and protecting a business relationship," he paused. "That's a distinction that matters legally." "He fired me in 14 hours, Nora said. "Which is evidence of something," Hargrove said, "but not necessarily of knowing about the fraud itself. We need more." She understood the distinction. She didn't particularly like it, but she understood it. What she was not prepared for was the call she received that afternoon from a number she didn't recognize, and when she picked up, the voice on the other end was Margaret Sloane's. Margaret said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't know if this is the right thing to do or not, but I've been sitting on it for 2 days and I can't anymore. Nora sat down. Tell me. The morning after you treated that dog, before your review, Price called me into his office at 6:30, which has never happened. He wanted to know everything I knew about your military background. Nora kept very still. He knew you'd been in the army, Margaret said. He already knew. He wasn't asking to find out. He was asking to see what I knew. A pause, and he said something that didn't make sense to me at the time, and I've been thinking about it ever since. He said, someone with her training notices things that aren't meant to be noticed. He said it like it was a problem, like you were the problem. The specific phrasing landed with a weight that felt physical. Someone with her training notices things that aren't meant to be noticed. He had known what she was, not a nurse who had been in the army. The actual category of person she was, the specific combination of skills she carried. And he'd said it before the review, before the termination, before any of the documentation work she'd done in the last 3 days. Margaret, she said, I need you to say that to a federal agent. A long pause. I know, Margaret said quietly. That's why I'm calling. Hargrove's reaction when Nora told him was controlled in the way of someone keeping a reaction controlled with some effort. He made 2 calls. The second one was to Moss. Nora could hear the shift in Moss's voice through the phone even from across the room. A change in cadence that meant the case had just moved in a direction that closed the gap between what they could prove and what they needed to prove. Margaret gave a formal statement that afternoon in a conference room at the Ridgeline Administration Building, which created an interesting situation because Price was in that building, 2 floors up, and did not yet know what was happening on the floor below him. Nora was not in that building. She was in her apartment, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with Camo's file in front of her, not for analysis, she'd long since finished with it analytically, but because she kept coming back to the specific notation in his service record, the hip injury, the 6-word description of a significant trauma that had then been managed and documented and then simply erased at the point where disclosure would have cost someone money. Her phone rang. Hargrove. Margaret's statement is solid, he said. The phrasing she quoted, Price knew specifics about your background that he could only have known if someone in the Meridian network had flagged you to him before the review. The timing confirms premeditation. Moss is moving on him tonight. Nora said, what does that mean, moving on him? Interview, not arrest. Not yet, but a formal recorded interview with her present, which makes it a federal proceeding. He won't be able to walk that back. She looked at Camo's file. And the dogs in the current pipeline, she said. The 19. All 19 have been reassigned to a different contractor for assessment. 3 of them are flagged for priority review based on your notes on their preliminary service records. A pause. You flagged those from partial documentation. The reassigned assessor confirmed your concerns on all 3. She sat with that for a moment. 3 dogs, whose conditions she'd identified from a partial read of incomplete records, now confirmed by a qualified assessor. She thought about what Hargrove had said 3 days ago in this kitchen. You found what our investigators had spent 3 months trying to articulate. She had not found it because she was exceptional. She had found it because she had spent years in environments where reading a record correctly meant the difference between someone living and someone dying, and that kind of training didn't leave you when you left the uniform. It just went quiet. It waited. Hargrove, she said, I want to be there. Where? When you interview Price, I don't need to be in the room, but I want to be there. A pause. That's not standard. I know it's not standard. Moss would have to approve it. Then ask her. He was quiet for a moment. I'll ask. He called back 20 minutes later. You can be in the building. Observation room if the facility has one. No direct involvement in the interview. That's fine, she said. That's enough. The Ridgeline Administration Building had a conference room with an observation window that was used primarily for HR mediations and had a direct visual line into the adjacent interview space. Nora stood in that room at 7:15 that evening in the same jacket she'd been wearing for 3 days and watched through the glass as Adrian Moss and Dennis Hargrove sat down across a table from Stuart Price. Price had a lawyer. Of course he had a lawyer. The lawyer was a man named Garrett, who had arrived looking polished and composed and had remained that way through the preliminary statements, which told Nora he'd been briefed but probably not fully, that he knew this was serious without yet knowing how serious, which was its own kind of preparation gap. Price, by contrast, looked like a man who had made a decision about how this was going to go and had not yet received the information that the decision was no longer available to him. He sat straight. He answered the opening questions crisply. He confirmed the timeline of Nora's employment review, the administrative process, the formal termination. He acknowledged the Ridgeline contract with Meridian Canine Solutions. He described it as a standard referral arrangement. Then Moss set a document on the table. It was a printed transcript of Purcell's phone call to Price. The call made 40 minutes before federal agents arrived at Purcell's home. The transcript had been reconstructed from cellular records and supplemented with a partial audio recovery that Strick's team had pulled from a backup server. Moss said, "In this call, Gary Purcell tells you, and I'm quoting directly, they're moving on the files. You need to handle the nurse." Awesome. "Can you tell me what you understood him to mean by that?" The lawyer said, "My client." "The nurse," Price said. The lawyer turned. "Stewart." Price looked at the transcript. He looked at it for a long time. From behind the glass, Nora watched his face. The particular quality of a decision collapsing, not dramatically, not with any visible emotion, but in the way of a structure that had been load-bearing meeting a force it hadn't accounted for and beginning, very quietly, to fail. He said, "I'd like to speak with my attorney privately." "Of course," Moss said. The interview paused. Nora stayed at the window. Strick appeared in the observation room doorway and said quietly, "Moss thinks he's going to cooperate." He didn't know the full scope. He knew Meridian had concerns about a specific employee, you, and he acted on that without knowing what the fraud actually was. He thought he was protecting a business relationship, not covering up a federal crime. "Does that distinction matter?" Nora said. "Legally, yes, to the core prosecution. No. Call Purcell the assessors. That case is built. Price's cooperation helps establish the network's reach." Strick paused. "It doesn't help him much, but it helps the case." Nora looked at the empty interview room through the glass. At the table where Price and his lawyer were now speaking in low voices she couldn't hear, she thought about the morning of her review, the 5 people at the table, the badge she'd put down and walked away from. The administrative language that had been used to do something that was neither administrative nor accidental. She had not been fired because she was difficult. She had been fired because she was effective, because the specific combination of what she knew and how she read information had made her dangerous to a structure that depended on nobody looking too carefully. They had looked at her and seen a nurse in faded scrubs with a history of insubordination and a habit of being right when her supervisors preferred she wasn't. They had not seen the rest of it. That was their mistake. The interview room door opened. Price and his lawyer came back to the table. Moss looked at Hargrove briefly, the smallest acknowledgement. Price said, "I want to cooperate. I want to tell you what I know." Nora turned away from the window. She didn't need to hear the rest of it. The rest of it was process. Important process, necessary process, but not hers to carry. She'd carried what was hers. She'd done it in a living room in Wyoming with 47 files and a notebook running out of pages, and it had been enough. She walked down the hallway and out through the side door and stood on the steps of the Ridgeline Administration Building in the cold night air. And she looked at the parking lot and the street beyond it and the dark outline of the mountains past that. And she breathed. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't have saved, but the area code was local, and when she read the message, she recognized the voice in it immediately. It was Reyes. "Camo is out of surgery. Cho said he came through clean. They're going to address the hip next week when he's stronger." She said whoever flagged the secondary condition saved him from a year of pain minimum, probably more. She read it twice. Then, because she was standing in a parking lot in the cold and her back hurt, and she hadn't slept properly in 3 days, and the adrenaline that had been carrying her since 4 a.m. 2 days ago was finally, visibly running out, she sat down on the concrete steps and let herself feel the weight of it. Not the fraud, not the prosecution, not the names and the files and the billing codes, but Camo. A 7-year-old working dog who had done everything asked of him and had been handed back broken, on paper, to a man who'd been trying to help him for 2 years without knowing what he was looking at. She typed back, "Tell him good." She sat on the steps for another few minutes. The cold was real and the quiet was real, and somewhere inside the building behind her, a man was cooperating with federal prosecutors, and the shape of what came next was already forming, and she was not in any of it yet, and right now that was fine. Her phone buzzed again. Not Reyes this time. Not Hargrove. The number on the screen was one she didn't recognize, a Wyoming number, but a different area code than any of the ones she'd been dealing with. The call came in at 7:58 p.m., and she almost didn't answer it because her threshold for unknown callers was approximately 0 right now. She answered it. The voice on the other end was male, older, with a specific quality of authority she associated with people who had spent decades in rooms where what they said was the last word on things. He said, "Ms. Voss, my name is General Arthur Pruitt, retired. I was the commanding general of the installation that housed K9 Unit Designation Sierra 4 during Camo's second deployment." A pause. "I understand you've been working with federal investigators on the Meridian case." She said, "Who gave you this number?" "Agent Hargrove, with my assurance that the reason I'm calling is relevant to your investigation." Another pause, and this one was different. Heavier. The weight of someone about to say something they'd been deciding whether to say for longer than the last few minutes. "Ms. Voss, the Meridian contract was not written by Philip Anker alone. When Anker submitted the contract renewal 4 years ago, it carried an endorsement from a senior advisory panel. I was on that panel. I signed the endorsement." The silence that followed was not empty. "I did not know at the time what Anker's relationship to Meridian was, but I have been aware for the past 18 months that something was wrong with the retirement assessments coming out of that contract, and I did not act on that awareness with the urgency I should have." Nora stood up from the steps. "General," she said slowly, "why are you calling me specifically?" "Because Hargrove told me you built the evidentiary foundation of this case in 48 hours, he said. "And because I want to tell you directly that the endorsement I gave to that contract renewal is a matter of public record. If the prosecution needs it for context, I am not going to contest its use." A pause. "And because I owe it to those animals to say that to someone who actually looked." She stood in the cold parking lot and looked at the mountains. She said, "I'll pass that to Adrienne Moss." "Please do." A pause. "One more thing. There's a name that keeps appearing in Meridian's internal communications that my team has been monitoring, a name that doesn't belong to any of the individuals already identified." The general's voice dropped a register, not for emphasis, but because what he was saying had a gravity that apparently required the adjustment. "We believe there is a fourth principal in the LLC, someone who has not appeared in any of the documentation you reviewed." Her hand tightened on the phone. "A fourth principal," she said. "Who?" The general said a name. It was not a name she recognized, but the job title that followed it, the current position, the institutional affiliation, the level of federal authority that name carried, those she recognized immediately, and they landed with the specific cold clarity of a revelation that was not a surprise but was worse for being confirmed. The case was not what she'd thought it was 3 days ago. It was not what she'd thought it was 3 hours ago. It was something else entirely. And the people who had tried to make sure she never saw any of it had no idea what they had actually set in motion the morning they decided a nurse in faded scrubs wasn't worth being careful about. The name the general had given her was Warren Delk. She looked it up that night on the secure laptop Strick had left with her, and what she found was exactly what the general's tone had prepared her for. A man whose public profile was clean in the specific way that institutional power kept things clean, where the surface was carefully maintained and the structure underneath was what you had to learn to read. Warren Delk was a senior procurement director at the Department of Defense. Not the top of the chain, but close enough to the top that the view from his office included most of the decisions that mattered. He had been in that position for 9 years. Before that, a deputy director role in the same office. Before that, 18 years in federal contracting administration. The kind of career that didn't make headlines and didn't need to because the work it did was structural, foundational in the way that foundations were foundational, which was to say invisible until something failed. He had appeared in Meridian's internal communications 11 times over 3 years, always obliquely, always through language that could be read as ordinary professional correspondence if you didn't know what you were looking for. Budget guidance, policy interpretation, contract renewal advisory notes. Nothing that said, I am a principal in an LLC that is receiving fraudulent payments from this company. Everything that said it anyway, once you had the billing records and the LLC registration and the pattern Nora had spent 48 hours assembling. She documented what she found and sent it to Hargrove at 11:40 p.m. and then sat at the kitchen table for a while with a cup of coffee that went cold before she drank half of it. She wasn't thinking about Delk specifically. She was thinking about the architecture, the way it had been built to distribute risk across enough people and enough layers that no single connection was ever obviously damning. Anchor at the contract level, call inside Meridian, the assessors at the field level, the LLC as the financial membrane, and Delk at the policy level, high enough that his involvement looked like oversight rather than participation. It was a system built by people who understood how systems got investigated, which meant it had been built to survive a certain kind of scrutiny, the kind of scrutiny that started from the outside and worked in. What it hadn't been built to survive was someone starting from the inside, from the medical records, from the physical reality of the animals themselves, from the specific notation that had been brief in a particular way, and working out. She went to bed at midnight and slept badly and woke at 5:30 with the particular alertness of someone whose brain had been working while the rest of them was trying to rest. Go. Hargrove was at her door at 7 with Strick and Dalton and a fourth person she hadn't met, a man named Soto from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, which told her that Delk's name had moved the case into a different jurisdictional space overnight. The FBI and DCIS didn't coordinate casually. They coordinated when the case was big enough that neither agency wanted to be seen as having dropped something, and Soto's presence meant that someone above Hargrove had made a decision about what this was. They spread out across her living room, which had become in the past 4 days a kind of operational center that she hadn't intended to host and had stopped being self-conscious about. Soto went straight to the financial documentation. He had his own materials, FBI sourced, which meant they had access to records that the DCIS subpoena hadn't reached yet, and he spent the first 20 minutes cross-referencing in silence while Hargrove walked Nora through what had happened overnight. The coordinated arrests had been moved up. The original timeline had been 48 hours, Price's cooperation, and then the general's call, and then what Nora had found about Delk had compressed that. Call was arrested at 6 this morning, Hargrove said. Purcell was already in federal custody from yesterday. Ferris was picked up in Denver at 4 a.m. The 3 Eastern assessors are in custody. He paused. Anchor was arrested at his home in Virginia at 5:15 a.m. Eastern. 7 arrests in a 12-hour window, coordinated across 3 states. And Delk? She said. That's more complicated. Hargrove looked at Soto, who had looked up from his documents at the sound of the name. Delk's position requires a different process. He's a senior federal employee. The Bureau has to move carefully, Soto said, not impatiently, just as a statement of operational reality. We don't arrest a DoD procurement director on an 11-month case timeline without the documentation being airtight. Arresting someone at his level and having anything go wrong in court is worse than taking another week to make sure it holds. How long? Nora asked. His financial records are subpoenaed as of this morning. We'll have them by end of week. If they confirm what the LLC registration and the Meridian communications suggest, Soto set his pen down. He's not going anywhere. He doesn't know yet that his name is in the investigation. Nora looked at him. You're certain he doesn't know? His communications have been monitored since 2 a.m., Soto said. No unusual activity, no calls to call or anchor, no contact with legal counsel beyond his regular schedule. A pause. He doesn't know, because he doesn't think he needs to know. He's been in this for 3 years and nothing has ever come close. She thought about that. About the confidence required to build a system like this and then simply continue existing inside your ordinary life while it operated. The specific arrogance of someone who had looked at the structure they'd built and decided it was sufficient. She thought about a dog named Wren with a forelimb injury notation that had been erased. About Bricks, who had died 14 months after a clearance that lied about his spine. She said, "I want to see what they find in his records." "You'll see it," Hargrove said. "You're part of this case, Nora. That's not going to change." The week that followed was not dramatic in the way the days before it had been. It was the kind of work that didn't look like anything from the outside. Careful, procedural, documentation intensive. And Nora did it from her kitchen table and occasionally from a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cheyenne when Moss needed her physically present. Moss was preparing for a grand jury presentation. She needed the medical analysis translated into language that a grand jury could follow, which meant Nora spent 3 days building a version of her documentation that explained step by step and without assuming any specialized knowledge what a retirement evaluation was supposed to contain, what these ones contained instead, and what the physical consequences of that gap had been for specific animals. She was writing about Bricks on the second day, about the vertebral compression notation, about the 14-month timeline, about what untreated spinal compression did to a working dog's quality of life and ultimately to its heart. And she had to stop for a few minutes and look out the window at the street because there was a point at which clinical precision and the actual weight of what you were describing became hard to hold at the same time. She went back to it. She finished it. It was accurate and it was complete, and it did not flinch from what it was describing, because flinching wasn't going to help Bricks and it wasn't going to help the 19 dogs who'd been pulled from the compromised pipeline. Moss read the completed analysis on the third afternoon and said, "Without any particular ceremony, this is the best expert document I've received in 11 years of prosecution work." Nora said, "It's not finished. I want to add a section on the systemic failure, on how the documentation structure enabled the fraud by creating gaps that looked like standard administrative variants." "How long will that take?" "Tonight." "Then take tonight." She took tonight. Delk's financial records arrived on Friday. Soto called Nora at 9 in the morning to tell her, and she could hear in the 2 syllables of "they're here" that the records were what they'd expected them to be, which meant they were worse than expected in the way that financial records of long-running fraud always were, because people who thought they were safe got comfortable, and comfort made them careless. She went to the FBI field office in Cheyenne, which was the first time she'd been in that building, and sat with Soto and Dalton and a third financial analyst named Okafor while they walked her through what Delk's records contained. The LLC receipts matched. 3 years of payments, consistent in their timing with the fraudulent invoice approvals in Meridian's internal records. The amounts were not large individually, built to stay below reporting thresholds, another sign of someone who understood the oversight mechanisms well enough to navigate around them. But across 3 years, they totaled $412,000, to Warren Delk specifically. Beyond the LLC payments, the records contained something that Soto had flagged overnight, and Okafor had spent the morning documenting: a series of wire transfers from an account registered to a subsidiary of Meridian's parent company to a personal brokerage account of Delk's that had been opened 6 months before the contract renewal he'd influenced through Anchor. He wasn't just taking LLC payments, Okafor said. He was trading on advanced knowledge of the contract renewal. The brokerage activity started 6 months before the renewal and spiked in the week following its approval. He knew the contract was going through, invested accordingly, and made an additional $90,000 in a single month. Nora looked at the trade records. "Insider trading on a federal contract," she said. "Securities fraud on top of wire fraud, on top of conspiracy to commit contract fraud," Soto said. "He's been doing this for 9 years at a senior level, and he never once thought it would reach him." "Why would he?" she said. Not a question. He was 9 layers above the assessors who were doing the actual falsification. He'd insulated himself with contractors and intermediaries and a shell company with 2 other principals between him and the payments. She looked at the brokerage records. He thought the animals were the end of the paper trail. He didn't think anyone would start from the animals and work backward. Soto looked at her. "Nobody had. Before you." She set the brokerage records down. She was not going to let herself feel anything particularly gratifying about that because the reason nobody had done it before was that 47 dogs had suffered in the gap, and that was not a foundation for satisfaction. "When are you moving on him?" she said. "Tuesday," Soto said. "The grand jury presentation is Monday. If the indictment comes back, and it will, we arrest him Tuesday morning." She nodded. "I want to know when it happens." "You'll know," he said. She drove back to Caldwell on Friday afternoon and stopped at the veterinary clinic where Camo was recovering because Reyes had texted her that morning to say they were doing the hip procedure that day and she wanted to know how it went. The clinic was a low building on the east side of town, nothing particular about it from the outside. She went in, and a vet tech named Dolores, who appeared to be about 23, and was very competent in the way of someone who had decided early that competence was the only thing worth investing in, told her that Camo was out of surgery and in recovery and that Captain Reyes was in the back. Reyes looked like he'd been there all day, which he had. He was sitting in a chair outside the recovery kennel with his jacket still on and a cup of coffee that had been empty for a while. He looked up when she came in. He said, "You didn't have to come. I was driving through anyway." They both knew she hadn't been driving through. He didn't argue it. Camo was visible through the kennel window, lying on his side, sedated still, breathing steadily. His left hip was bandaged. He looked smaller than he had in the emergency room, which he knew was a function of the stillness rather than any change in him, but it was still an adjustment. Dr. Cho said the joint damage was significant, Reyes said. Worse than the initial assessment showed. The compression had been building for... He stopped. She said probably 3 years. At least, Nora said. Which means it was there when they cleared him. He said it flat. Not as a question, and not as an explosion of anger, just as a fact being placed on a surface to be looked at. Yes, she said. And the people who cleared him. In custody, she said. The people above them are about to be. He looked at Camo through the glass. How far up did it go? Further than the assessors, she said. That's all I can tell you right now. He nodded once. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You lost your job over this. I lost a job, she said. That's different. He looked at her. Is Ridgeline going to face anything? She thought about Price in the interview room, about the cooperation agreement Moss had described in the cautious language of ongoing proceedings. The director is cooperating with the federal investigation. There will be consequences. What they look like exactly is still being determined. That means maybe, he said. That means the process is running, she said, which is different from maybe, even if it's slower. He sat with that. He was not the kind of man who needed reassurance framed as certainty, which made him easier to talk to than most. She stayed for another 20 minutes. When she left, Camo was still sedated, and Reyes was still in the chair, and she thought about the two of them, the man and the dog, both of them carrying things they'd been given no adequate way to put down. And she drove back to Caldwell in the late afternoon light, thinking about the gap between institutional language and the actual weight of what institutions did to the people inside them when they failed. The grand jury returned the indictment on Monday at 2:17 in the afternoon. Moss called Nora when the result came through, and she said simply, "It's done," and then gave her the counts, which took a while because there were many of them. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction, and in Delk's case, the additional securities fraud charge that Okafor had documented. Call faced 7 counts. Anchor faced 5. Delk faced 12. Nora was sitting on her couch when the call came in. She had been trying to read a book, a thing she hadn't done in 10 days, and failing because the words kept not landing. She set the book down while Moss talked and looked at the living room floor, which was clean now, the files returned to federal custody, the surface bare, and felt the specific quality of an ended thing that hadn't fully registered as ended yet. She said, "The animals, the ones in the pipeline who were reassigned. All 19 have been assessed by the replacement contractor," Moss said. 11 have conditions that require treatment before placement. They're being treated. A pause. The 3 you flagged are in active care. And the dog's already placed. The ones from the fraudulent evaluations. That's the civil side, Moss said. The settlement framework will include veterinary care and monitoring for all animals identified in the case. A pause. It's not perfect. Some of them have conditions that can be managed but not reversed. But it's something. It was something, not enough and something, which was often the only available answer. Moss said, I want to talk to you about your role going forward. You're the primary expert witness for the prosecution. That means depositions, probably testimony, a significant time commitment over the next several months, she paused. And I want to talk to you about a formal consulting relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the duration of the case. Paid, with security clearance, which you'll qualify for given your service record. It's not your old job, but it's something that uses what you actually know. Nora looked at the empty floor. She thought about the granola bar over the sink, about the review, about the badge she'd set on the table and walked away from. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, Moss said. On Tuesday morning at 8:45, Warren Delk was arrested at his office at the Department of Defense by 2 FBI agents and walked out of the building through the main entrance. There were people in the lobby. There were people in the parking structure. There were 2 reporters who had been tipped off about something significant happening that morning without being given a name, and who had positioned themselves accordingly, and who therefore had photographs and video of a senior DoD procurement director being escorted through the building he'd worked in for 9 years with his hands behind his back. Nora was in her apartment in Caldwell when Hargrove sent her the text. 2 words. He's done. She read it. She set the phone down. She looked out the window at the ordinary Wednesday morning street. A woman walking a dog, a truck making a delivery. The unremarkable continuity of a town that didn't know what had happened in a living room inside it last week. Her phone rang. Not Hargrove, not Moss, not Reyes. It was a number she recognized as the main line for Ridgeline Valley Medical Center. She almost didn't answer it. She let it ring 3 times, 4, and then picked up because ignoring things had never actually been her method, even when it would have been easier. It was not Margaret. The voice on the other end was a woman she'd spoken to once, briefly, 8 months ago at a hospital-wide staff meeting. Dr. Vivian Oduya, the chair of Ridgeline's medical board. Nora remembered her because she'd asked the only genuinely interesting question at that meeting and had not seemed satisfied with the answer she received, which had made Nora pay attention. Oduya said, Ms. Voss, I'm calling because the medical board convened an emergency session yesterday evening. Okay, Nora said carefully. Dr. Price's cooperation agreement with the federal investigation requires his immediate resignation. He submitted it yesterday at 5 p.m. A pause. The board has also reviewed the process by which your termination was executed, and we have concluded that it does not meet Ridgeline's own standards for administrative review. Nora was quiet. We'd like to meet with you, Oduya said. At your convenience, to discuss the circumstances of your departure and what, if anything, we can do to address them appropriately. The word appropriately sat in the air. It was careful language, institutional language, but underneath it was something that wasn't entirely performative, because Oduya had asked the only good question at that staff meeting, and she had an instinct for people who said things that meant something. Nora said, I appreciate the call, Dr. Oduya. I'll be in touch. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Outside, the woman with the dog had turned the corner, and the street was briefly empty. She thought about what Moss had said, about depositions and testimony and a consulting relationship that used what she actually knew. She thought about 47 files on a living room floor and the annotation system she'd built in the middle of the night, because the organizational systems she'd tried first weren't going to work for someone coming in cold. She was thinking about that, about what it meant to build a system that worked for people who didn't already know what they were looking at, when her laptop chimed. An email from an address she didn't recognize with a federal government domain suffix and a subject line that read, MWDP Review Panel, Consultation Request. She opened it. It was from a Colonel Renata Vasquez at the Department of Defense, Office of Inspector General. The email was brief and formal and explained in 4 paragraphs that the Meridian case had prompted a comprehensive review of the military working dog retirement and placement program. and that the review panel was seeking consultants with combined military, medical, and veterinary documentation expertise to assist in developing new evaluation standards. The email said they had been given her name by General Arthur Pruitt. It said the panel's first meeting was in Washington in 3 weeks. It said, "We understand this may require significant consideration. We hope you will give it serious thought." She read it twice. Then she looked at the empty floor where the files had been. At the walls of the apartment that had for a week contained the entire evidence base of a federal fraud prosecution. At the kitchen counter and the crackers and the coffee that had gone cold while she worked. She thought about what Reyes had said at the veterinary clinic. "You lost your job over this." And what she'd said back. "I lost a job." She closed the laptop. She was going to need a bigger table. But before that, before Washington and the review panel and the depositions and the formal consulting arrangement and all the procedural weight of what came next, she opened her contacts and found Reyes's number and typed a message. Because there was something she needed to know, and it wasn't going to be answered by any of the emails or calls she'd fielded that morning. She typed, "How's he doing today?" The answer came back in under a minute. A photograph. Camo, lying in a patch of afternoon sun that must have been coming through a window somewhere in the clinic, his eyes open and clear, his head resting on his front paws, the bandaged hip visible, but the rest of him calm, not the frantic, painful stillness of an animal in distress, but the actual rest of a body beginning to understand that the worst of it was over. Reyes had written one word under the photo: better. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she opened the email from Colonel Vasquez. She hit reply. She wrote, "I'll be there." She was about to close the laptop when a second email arrived. This one from an address she didn't recognize at all. Not a federal domain, not a hospital, nothing she could place. The subject line was 4 words. "You should know this." She hesitated. She opened it. There was no text in the body of the email, just an attachment, a single PDF, 7 pages. She opened it and skimmed the first page and felt something cold move through her chest. It was an internal Meridian document, a communication chain printed and scanned dated 14 months ago. And in the third message in the chain, in language that was careful and oblique but not careful or oblique enough, there was a reference to a specific employee at a specific hospital who had been identified as a potential risk to the contract's operational integrity. The hospital was Ridgeline Valley Medical Center. The employee was referred to only by job title and a notation: prior military, K-9 adjacent training, embedded in our referral network facility. The date on the message was 14 months ago, which was 8 months before Camo ever walked through the emergency room doors, which meant they hadn't been reacting to her. They had known about her. They had been watching her specifically for 8 months as a potential threat to the operation. And when the moment came, when Reyes brought Camo in and she picked up that file, they had moved immediately because they'd already made the decision. They'd already decided what to do if she ever found the thread. They had been afraid of her before she knew there was anything to be afraid of. She sat very still. She read the document again, all 7 pages this time, slowly. The sender's email address at the top of the chain was a Meridian internal address she recognized from the operational records. The recipient included Raymond Call, and one other address, an external address, personal domain that she hadn't seen in any of the case documentation. She forwarded the entire email to Hargrove, to Moss, and to Soto with a single line. This just arrived. Unknown sender. Read the third message in the chain. Tell me whose personal email address that is. She closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall and thought about being watched, about being identified 14 months ago as a risk by people who had no reason to know she existed unless someone had given them a reason, unless someone had told them where to look. The Ridgeline contract with Meridian, 3 years old. Price's cooperation agreement, which covered what he knew about her removal, but which she realized she had never specifically asked about the beginning, not the week Camo came in, but earlier. The establishment of the referral contract, the first communication between Price and the Meridian network. Her phone rang. Soto. She picked up. He said, without preamble, "Where did you get this document?" "Unknown sender. It arrived 3 minutes ago." The personal email address in the chain. His voice had the quality of controlled urgency she'd come to recognize. It belongs to someone we haven't been able to place in the network until now. Who? She said. A pause. Short, but weighted. It belongs to Margaret Sloane, he said. The silence after Soto said the name lasted about 4 seconds, which was long enough for Nora to understand that she was not going to react to this the way she might have wanted to. Margaret Sloane. The woman who had called her to say she hadn't recommended the termination, who had said I didn't know with a voice that carried the particular weight of someone telling the truth, who had then called again unprompted to give a formal statement about what Price had said in his office at 6:30 in the morning, someone with her training notices things that aren't meant to be noticed, a statement that had materially advanced the case against him. Nora sat very still and thought about all of that, and then she thought about the email chain and the date on it, and she said to Soto, "What is her role in the chain specifically?" "She's a recipient on 2 messages," he said, "not an initiator. The messages she received are informational. She's being told that you've been flagged as a potential risk to the referral contract. She's not responding, not forwarding, not acting on them in any documented way. But she received them. Yes. 14 months ago. Yes." Nora stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The street was still ordinary. The truck had finished its delivery. A different woman was walking a different dog, and the whole surface of the morning had not changed at all. She knew, Nora said. For 14 months, she knew I had been flagged. She knew Meridian had specifically identified me as a threat to their operation. "We don't know yet what she understood from receiving those messages," Soto said carefully. "Receiving information and understanding its full context aren't the same thing legally." "But she knew enough to call me after my termination," Nora said. "She knew enough to say she hadn't recommended it. She knew enough to give a statement about Price." She stopped. "Was the statement true?" "We believe so. What she said about Price's conversation is corroborated by the timeline and by his own cooperation." A pause. "Which means she may have been trying to help you, while also sitting on information she should have disclosed." Nora pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the window. It was cold through the plaster from the outside air. A concrete, present, undeniable sensation, which was what she needed right now. "Who sent the document to me?" she said. "We don't know yet. The email routing is being traced. It came through 3 anonymizing servers." Soto's voice was measured. "Someone wanted you to have this specifically. Someone who knew your personal email, knew what you were working on, and had access to Meridian's internal communications. Someone inside the network," she said, "or someone adjacent to it who decided the arrests weren't going far enough." She thought about that, about the 14-month timeline, about all the people who had been sitting on pieces of this for longer than the investigation had been running. She said, "What are you going to do about Margaret?" "We're going to talk to her," Soto said, "today. Her cooperation so far counts for something, but she needs to account for what she knew and when." A pause. "I wanted you to hear this from me before we moved on her." "I appreciate that." "Nora." His voice shifted register slightly. "This isn't going to unwind what she gave us on Price. That testimony stands. But the picture is more complicated than it looked," she said. "Yes." She looked at the street. "It usually is," she said. She did not call Margaret. She had thought about it on and off for the rest of that morning, and she kept arriving at the same answer, which was that calling her would not produce a conversation that helped either of them and would potentially compromise whatever Soto's interview turned up. So she didn't call. She sat with the discomfort of not calling, which was its own kind of discipline. What she did instead was write, not case documentation, not an expert analysis. She opened a new document on her personal laptop and started writing notes to herself about what the last 10 days had actually looked like from the inside. Not the case timeline, not the evidentiary structure, but the experience of it. The granola bar over the sink, the review, the badge on the table, the living room floor covered in 47 folders at 2 in the morning, the specific quality of camo going still when she crouched down in the blood. She wasn't sure why she was writing it. She wasn't a person who journaled, but something needed to be placed somewhere outside her head, and this was the available container. She wrote for 2 hours and didn't look at it when she stopped. She saved it and closed the document and went to make lunch, which she ate at the kitchen table looking at the wall, and then she called Moss. "Margaret Sloan," she said when Moss picked up. "Soto called you," Moss said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. What's her exposure?" A pause. "She received information about a federal investigation target, technically you, before you were an investigation participant, and did not disclose it to law enforcement. That's potentially obstruction adjacent, but her cooperation on Price is documented and substantive, and the email evidence shows her as a passive recipient rather than an active participant." Moss paused. "She's not going to be charged, Nora. She's going to receive a formal caution and be required to give a full disclosure statement, but her situation is more human than criminal." Nora thought about more human than criminal and what that phrase contained. The way people got pulled into proximity with something wrong through gradual connection rather than deliberate choice. The way receiving an email and not knowing what to do with it could look, 14 months later, like a decision it maybe hadn't been at the time. She didn't absolve Margaret in her head. She also didn't convict her. "Okay," she said. "How are you?" Moss asked. It was the first time she'd asked that in 10 days. Nora considered the question genuinely. "I'm functional," she said. "Ask me again in a month." Moss made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Fair." Soto's interview with Margaret Sloan took place that afternoon in a federal building in Cheyenne and lasted 3 hours. Nora wasn't there and didn't ask for a readout immediately. She got it 2 days later in a summary from Hargrove, which told her what she'd half suspected. Margaret had received the first Meridian email 14 months ago and had understood it as a warning from the hospital's contracting partner that a specific nurse's habit of escalating clinical disputes was creating friction in the referral relationship. She had understood it as an employment management note. She had not understood it as evidence of fraud because she had not known there was fraud to understand it in the context of. When Nora was fired and Margaret called her, she'd been operating on a complicated mixture of genuine guilt and the residual knowledge that there had been external pressure on Nora's position that she hadn't fully understood and had not investigated. Her statement about Price had been true. Her silence about the email had been the decision of someone who had convinced herself it wasn't relevant because she hadn't understood what it was relevant to. It was not a heroic story. It was a human one, the kind of incrementally rationalized blindness that didn't require malice to do real damage. Margaret had not helped destroy Nora's career. She had also not stopped it when stopping it had been possible, and those two things could both be true at the same time. Nora read Hargrove's summary, set it down, and didn't pick it up again. The grand jury indictments became public on a Thursday morning, and by 10 a.m. it was not a small story. 12 individuals charged across a federal wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy case involving the systematic falsification of military working dog retirement evaluations over 3 years, with a financial network extending to a senior Department of Defense procurement official. The DoD angle was what made it national. The contractor fraud alone might have stayed regional, but Warren Delk's name and his title and the photographs of his arrest walk through a federal building turned it into something that moved across every major outlet by noon. Nora watched none of it in real time. She was in Washington. The MWDP review panel's first meeting was in a conference room inside a DoD-adjacent building on a street in Northwest Washington that looked like every other street in Northwest Washington, and Nora arrived 12 minutes early because she was constitutionally incapable of arriving late to anything and sat in the hallway drinking bad vending machine coffee until Colonel Vasquez came out to meet her. Renata Vasquez was 52, compact, with a posture that said military without advertising it. She shook Nora's hand and looked at her with the direct, assessing quality of someone who had been deciding how much to trust her own judgment about people for 30 years and had gotten reasonably good at it. She said, "General Prewitt speaks very highly of you." "General Prewitt was kind to call me," Nora said. "He said you found in 48 hours what a 12-month investigation hadn't articulated." She held the door open. He said it like a man who was aware he should have articulated it himself and was trying to give credit where it would do the most good. Nora walked through the door. The conference room had 8 people in it. Military, federal, 2 veterinary specialists she recognized by institutional affiliation from publications she'd read, and a civilian analyst who was introduced as the panel's documentation lead. They were a mixed assembly of people who had come to this problem from different angles and had not yet found the common language for it. Nora had spent 10 days inside the documents. She had the language. The meeting ran 4 hours. She spoke for maybe 40 minutes of it, but those 40 minutes reoriented the discussion in a way she could feel happening in real time. The moment when a group of people who have been approaching a problem from the outside find someone who has been inside it and can hand them the map. She was not impressive seeming while she did it. She wore the same jacket she always wore. She spoke at a reasonable volume with the expectation of being heard. She corrected one of the veterinary specialists on a documentation standard and did it without apology because it needed correcting. She answered questions fully and said, "I don't know," once, when she didn't know, without dressing it up. After the meeting, Vasquez walked her to the elevator. She said, "The panel wants you as a full consultant for the evaluation redesign. 12 months, renewable. Security clearance is already in process." A pause. "I want to be honest with you. This work is slow. It's bureaucratic. It will frustrate you regularly. The outcomes take years to see." "I know what long timelines look like," Nora said. "I imagine you do." Vasquez looked at her. "The redesign, if we do it correctly, will change the standard of care for every military working dog that goes through the retirement process from this point forward. That's the actual scope of what we're asking you to help build." Nora thought about 47 files on a living room floor, about the blank boxes in the evaluation sections, about how a document that was supposed to protect an animal had been built with gaps in it that looked like administrative variants until someone started from the animal itself and worked backward through the paper. She said, "Then we should build it so the gaps can't be hidden." Vasquez nodded once. "That's exactly what we should build." Done. She flew back to Wyoming on a Friday evening, and the flight was 2 hours in a middle seat between a man who fell asleep immediately and a woman doing spreadsheets. And Nora looked out the window at the dark shape of the country below and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, the specific tiredness that was different from exhaustion, the kind that meant the acute phase was over and the body was beginning to settle. She was not done. The depositions hadn't started. The trial timeline for the core defendants was estimated at 8 to 14 months. The evaluation redesign was a year of work minimum. The question of Ridgeline and what, if anything, she wanted from that conversation with Oduya was still sitting unanswered on a mental shelf she hadn't gotten to. But the acute phase was over. The thing that had needed to happen in 48 hours had happened. The structure was standing. She looked at the dark window and thought about the scar on her arm, the pale ridge under the black ink, and about the specific discipline of carrying something for a long time without making it the center of everything. She'd learned that in places that hadn't been gentle about teaching it. The lesson had not been clean, and it had not been without cost, and she would not recommend the curriculum. But here she was. The sentencing hearings happened over 4 months, which was faster than Moss had expected and slower than Nora had hoped, which was the nature of federal timelines. She attended 2 of them in person, the ones that mattered most to her specifically. Raymond Call received 11 years. The judge read the counts with the particular flat clarity of someone who had decided not to editorialize and didn't need to, because the counts were editorial enough. Fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, laundering, and a specific enhancement for the harm caused to animals that had served in federal military operations. Call sat at the defense table and looked at the surface of it and did not look at the gallery, which was where Nora was sitting in the second row. She did not need him to look at her. She was not there for that. Gary Purcell received 6 years and a cooperation credit that Moss had fought harder against than she let on, because the cooperation had been genuine and the prosecution would have been harder without it, and hard things sometimes required accepting imperfect outcomes in exchange for complete ones. Philip Anker received 8 years. Brenda Ferris received 4 and was ordered to cooperate fully with the civil proceedings that were running parallel to the criminal case. Warren Delk's sentencing was the last one, and it was the one that drew press because Delk was the name that had made it national. He received 14 years on 12 counts. His attorney made a statement about career service and distinguished record, and the court acknowledged both and sentenced him anyway, because distinguished records and federal crimes were not mutually exclusive and the law did not operate on a net calculation of a person's contributions. Nora was not at Delk's sentencing. She was in a conference room in Washington that day, in the fourth week of the evaluation redesign working sessions, arguing with a DoD standards official about the specific threshold for what constituted a documentable musculoskeletal finding in a working dog's field record. She won the argument. She had the clinical documentation to support her position, and she presented it without backing down, and the standard was changed. It was not dramatic. Nobody photographed it. It would not appear in any article about the case. But it was the part of it that would last longest. Stuart Price resigned from Ridgeline Valley Medical Center as required by his cooperation agreement and received a civil penalty and a 5-year prohibition from serving in any administrative capacity at a federally contracted healthcare facility. He did not face criminal charges. Moss had explained the distinction to Nora with the precision of someone who understood that the law did not always produce the same result as justice and who had made peace with doing the best available work within that gap. Nora had made a different peace with it, which was that Price's consequence, losing the position and the authority and the institutional standing he had built his identity around, was not nothing, even if it wasn't everything. Dr. Fallon remained at Ridgeline. That one stung slightly, in the distant way of things you couldn't do anything about. But Fallon had not been part of the Meridian network. He had filed a complaint against a nurse he found difficult, and hospitals were full of doctors who filed complaints against nurses they found difficult. And that was an institutional problem Nora was not positioned to fix by herself. She had other problems to fix. Margaret Sloan received no formal charges and gave a complete disclosure statement and continued at Ridgeline in her charge nurse role. Nora received 2 more calls from her over the following months, one in which Margaret tried to explain herself at some length, and one, 6 weeks later, that was much shorter and more honest, in which she said simply, "I should have looked harder at what I was being sent. I knew something was off, and I told myself it wasn't my business. It was my business." Nora said, "I know." There was a long pause on the line. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Nora said. "Are you?" "Getting there," Margaret said. That was, in the end, a more honest answer than most people managed. Said, she met with Dr. Oduya in March. It was a Tuesday, cold still, the tail end of a Wyoming winter that was not in a hurry to conclude. They sat in Oduya's office at Ridgeline, not the boardroom, not a formal setting, just an office with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the parking structure, which was not a view, but was at least honest about what it was. Oduya said, "The board wants to make this right. I want to be direct about the fact that I don't know exactly what that looks like, and I'm not going to offer you something hollow." Nora respected that. "I'm not coming back to Ridgeline," she said. "I want to be equally direct. That's not what I'm here for." "Then what are you here for?" Nora thought about it. She looked at the window, at the parking structure, at the ordinary functional reality of a hospital that had failed her in specific ways and not failed her in others, where Tobias had followed her instruction exactly right at 2 a.m, where Margaret had carried something complicated for a long time, where a younger nurse had looked at her across a busy emergency room and decided that she was the one who knew what they were doing. "I want the hospital to change the protocol for when a patient comes in with circumstances outside standard scope," she said. "Not informal judgment calls. A documented decision framework for unusual situations that protects the nurse or physician making the call if the call turns out to be right." Oduya looked at her. "That's a governance change." "I know what it is," Nora said. "I also know what happens without it." Oduya was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up a pen. "Tell me what it needs to contain," Nora told her. Kamo's second surgery, the full hip reconstruction that Dr. Cho had been planning since the initial procedure, happened in April. Nora was not there for it, but Reyes sent her a text when it was done, and she sent back what she always sent, which was, "Tell him good." She drove out to see them in May, when Camo was cleared for light activity. They were at Reyes's property, a piece of land east of Caldwell with a long, flat field behind the house that was just beginning to go green, and Camo was moving across it in the low afternoon sun at a pace that was careful and slightly lopsided, but was movement, real movement, chosen movement, the movement of an animal that had been given back something that had been taken from him without his knowledge. Reyes stood beside her at the fence and watched. He said, "Cho says he'll always have some limitation. The joint damage was too advanced for a full restoration." "I know," Nora said, "but she says he's not in pain." He paused. "She said that specifically, that whatever he has left, it's not pain." They watched Camo move across the field. He stopped once, turned his head, looked back at them with those dark, attentive eyes. Then he kept going. Reyes said, "He knew you, first night, before you did anything. Working dogs read people," she said. "It's trained in, but it goes deeper than training after a while." "What do they read?" She thought about how to answer that, about what she'd learned in years of working in environments where the margin between a correct read and an incorrect one was measured in whether people came home, about what it actually meant to pay attention, not to what people presented, but to the structure underneath the presentation. "Whether you mean it," she said finally, "whether what you're doing and what you're feeling are the same thing. They can't articulate the distinction, but they feel it immediately." She paused. "He knew I meant it." Reyes nodded. He didn't say anything else, because it didn't need anything else. They stood at the fence until the light started to go, and Camo made his careful, lopsided way back across the field and came to the fence and rested his head briefly on Nora's hand, the way he had in the photograph, the way she somehow hadn't been prepared for in person, the actual weight of it, the warmth of it, the specific trust of an animal that had been failed by more paperwork than it would ever understand and had, against all reasonable animal logic, decided to extend that trust again. She kept her hand still. She let him decide when he was done. The evaluation redesign was completed in September, 14 months after the panel's first meeting. The new military working dog retirement assessment framework, 42 pages with appendices, was adopted as the federal standard across all 4 branches. It was not a perfect document. Nora had argued about 7 sections of it and lost 4 of those arguments and won 3, which was roughly the ratio she'd learned to expect from institutional processes and had stopped being frustrated by around month 6. The version that was adopted was better than what had existed. It was not as good as what she'd wanted. That gap was where most meaningful work lived. Her name appeared in the acknowledgments, not prominently, in a list with 11 other contributors, alphabetical by last name. She read it once and did not read it again. What she kept instead was a single document, a copy of the before and after. The old evaluation framework on the left, 3 pages, full of the structural gaps she'd identified in those 47 folders. The new one on the right, 42 pages, with mandatory cross-reference requirements for prior service records, mandatory independent secondary review for any animal with a documented field injury, and a specific prohibition on expedited clearance designations without a veterinary specialist co-signature. The blank boxes couldn't be blank anymore. The gaps had been filled, not with words, with structure, with a system that assumed someone would try to hide something and made hiding it significantly harder, which was the only kind of protection that actually worked long-term because it didn't depend on any individual's courage or attention. It was baked in. It would outlast the specific people who'd built it. That was what she'd been trying to build since she sat on her living room floor at 2 a.m, looking at 47 folders, and understood that the problem was not the people who had cheated, but the architecture that had made cheating invisible. She did not go back to Ridgeline. She did not go back to a hospital floor at all, not in any ongoing capacity, and she did not grieve that as much as she'd thought she might. The consulting work used a different set of muscles than floor nursing, and they were muscles she'd been carrying a long time without formal use, and working them felt like returning to a version of herself she'd put down rather than lost. She was not uncomplicated. She woke up some mornings with the specific weight of the faces in those files. Not the paperwork, but the actual animals. The ones who'd died. The ones like Bricks, who'd had 14 months in a life that should have been easier. And she didn't have a system for putting that down other than getting up and making coffee and going back to work. That was not a profound coping mechanism. It was just the one she had, and it was functional, and she had stopped holding herself to a standard of internal elegance that the actual conditions of a working life didn't support. She missed some things about floor nursing. She missed Tobias, who had turned out to be exceptionally good, and who she'd told so directly in a brief email 6 months after she left, which he'd responded to with 3 sentences that were formal with the effort of someone trying to sound formal, and which had made her smile at her kitchen table. She missed the particular clarity of a crisis that had a concrete resolution within a specific time frame. The body either stabilized or it didn't, and you knew, and then you moved to the next one. The work she was doing now had longer timelines and less visible outcomes, and she was still learning how to sustain herself across that distance. She was not certain she was succeeding. She was making progress. There was a difference. On an October morning, 14 months after a wounded Belgian Malinois had walked through the emergency room doors of a hospital in Caldwell, Wyoming, Nora Voss stood in a federal courtroom in Cheyenne as the last deposition in the civil settlement proceedings was read into the record. The settlement covered 44 animals identified in the case. Veterinary care, monitoring, and compensation for handlers who had incurred costs treating conditions that should have been disclosed at retirement. 3 animals had died before the settlement was finalized, and their handlers received a separate acknowledgement and a number that could not actually account for what they'd lost, because numbers could not, and the court said so explicitly in the settlement language, which Nora thought was the most honest thing she'd read in a legal document in a long time. She was not the one reading it. She was in the gallery. She was technically just present. But she was present, which was not nothing. Presence was what she had always been able to offer, so as actual, undivided, paying attention presence, in rooms where it was easier to step back than to stay. She had stayed. After the proceedings concluded, she walked out through the main entrance into October air that was cold and clear and carried the specific quality of a Wyoming autumn that she had never once taken for granted and was not starting now. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment without going anywhere. Her phone was in her pocket. She had 3 emails to respond to and a call to return to Colonel Vasquez about the panel's second-year scope and a message from Moss about the anchor appeal, which was not unexpected and was not going to succeed, but was going to require another round of documentation review. She did not look at any of it yet. She stood on the steps and looked at the street and the sky and the ordinary Tuesday morning movement of a city going about its business, and she thought about what it actually meant to be someone that people had decided was not worth being careful about. They had looked at her and seen a problem that could be managed. A nurse with a complaint record and a habit of being right and a past she didn't talk about. Someone who could be moved out of the way without significant consequence. What they had not seen, what they had been so confident they didn't need to see, was the rest of it. The years of learning to read a record correctly when the margin for misreading it was someone's life. The discipline of staying in rooms where it was easier to leave. The specific, quiet, completely unspectacular capacity to look at a blank box in a document and understand that blank boxes were not the same as empty ones. They had made her small in their minds because small was easier to manage. She had never been small. She had been patient. She had been tired. She had been wrong about some things and right about others. And she had a scar on her arm under a tattoo and a stiff neck from too many hours at a kitchen table and a set of skills she had not asked for and would not trade. She was not a symbol. She was not a lesson. She was a specific person who had done specific work under specific conditions, and the work had mattered, and she knew it had mattered, and that knowledge did not require anyone else's validation to be real, but it had received it anyway. And standing on those steps in the October cold, she allowed herself that, just that. Not a triumph, not a vindication, not a cinematic moment of arrival, just the plain, solid, unglamorous satisfaction of someone who had looked at a thing that was wrong and had refused, despite every institutional pressure available, to look away. The scar on her arm was not a wound anymore. It was a record of everything she had survived, of everything she had learned inside the surviving, of the particular cost of being the kind of person who stays in the room. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and walked down the courthouse steps and turned toward the parking structure, and she was already thinking about the emails and the call to Vasquez and the documentation review for Anchor's appeal and what she wanted for lunch. The work was not over. She didn't need it to be.